Okay, good evening and welcome to Science Cafe New Hampshire's June 2021 event. My name is Rick Irving and I will be your host and moderator for tonight's session on animal behavior and pet psychology. Last month, we celebrated the 10th anniversary of Science Cafe New Hampshire as well as the first anniversary of our series of virtual sessions. Tonight is also special because we have teamed up our Nashua, New Hampshire's Science Cafe New Hampshire with our colleagues at the Manchester, New Hampshire's Manchester Sea Science Center and their Science on Tap program to offer a combined virtual event to both of our audiences. We certainly hope that you all enjoy our first partnership effort. On that note, I would like to introduce a special guest before we get to this evening's expert. Please welcome Adele Morier, who is the design coordinator of the Manchester Sea Science Center. Adele, welcome. It is a pleasure to have you join us tonight, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Rick. Hello and welcome everyone to this special event celebrating 10 years of community science discussions in New Hampshire. Events like this one are part of the worldwide movement to increase interaction between scientists, researchers, and experts, and the general public through informal discussions. I am from the Sea Science Center, as Rick mentioned, and Sea has been hosting discussions since 2011, and our ongoing series, Science on Tap, since 2013. Tonight, we are joining our friends from Science Cafe New Hampshire, which has been hosting discussions in Nashua and Concord since 2011. It has been exciting for all of us to be able to collaborate and to invite our audience together for tonight's topic, animal behavior and psychology. As always, we hope everyone at home will participate by submitting questions. You can either do, which you can do whether you're watching by Facebook or YouTube, using the chat features. I would now like to turn it back over to Rick to tell us more about tonight's topic.
Thank you, Adele. As Adele just mentioned, tonight's discussion will be focused on animal behavior and pet psychology. So, whether you're a pet owner wondering what Fido is barking at, a nature show lover who wonders why those researchers are watching those wild animals, or if you just want to learn things that are really fascinating, this month's session gives us a new way of understanding why animals behave the way they do, and how we figured it out. Our panelists include both professional animal behaviorists and research-driven academics, and those areas often overlap. This session covers both the academic and practical basis of how we study animals, and consequently, how we apply what we learn for the benefit of our four-legged friends. I'd like to mention a couple points before we begin our introductions. As always, you may start submitting your audience questions for the panel at any time. Please use the comment section of Facebook or YouTube, whichever you're using to watch us tonight, to send your questions directly to us. Our colleagues will collect them and forward your questions to us to address to the panel. We ask that you be succinct with your questions, and if you would, for general interest purposes only, include your name and your location. And now I would like to introduce the panel. Thank you. Tonight we have an excellent and very accomplished panel, and it's my pleasure to welcome them to the show. Start with Dr. Catherine Haupt. She's joining us from Ithaca, New York. She is the James Law Professor Emeritus in the Department of Clinical Studies at Cornell University. She has her BMD and PhD in behavioral biology from the University of Pennsylvania. She studies domestic animal welfare and behavior in horses primarily, and has a particular focus on improving research and environments. Dr. Haupt, would you please tell us a little bit about yourself, and welcome to you. I'm so glad you joined us tonight.
Well, you asked me to say when I first got interested in animal behavior, and that was when my first dog ran away to the nearby army base. This was during World War II, and we had meat rationing, but the Army did not. So I've been particularly interested in food intake ever since.
Great, thank you. Our next panelist is Dr. Linda Aronson. She is joining us from Massachusetts. She's originally from England, and she received her bachelor's and master's degree in physiological sciences at Oxford University. She received her DVM from the Tufts University School of Veterinary Medicine here in the Boston area. She is a professional referral behavior. She has a professional referral behavior practice working with dogs, cats, and horses, and he has made a lifelong study of animal behavior of both domestic and wild animals. Dr. Aronson, we're so glad you could be with us tonight. Please tell us about yourself.
Well, to echo Kathy, when did I first get interested in animal behavior? It was probably when I studied insects as a child. I don't know how much insects think, but I probably imposed my own thoughts more on them than they actually came up with on their own. But yeah, animal behavior, it's what makes us all tick and makes them tick. So yeah, it's a lifelong avocation.
Great, thank you. Next, we have Dr. Valerie Chalcraft. Valerie is currently the professor of feline behavior and animal behavior at the Animal Behavior Institute in Durham, North Carolina. She has a PhD and an MA in experimental psychology. She is an applied animal behaviorist who has designed a PhD exam on animal welfare focused studying of primates in laboratory settings. And she has recently consulted on animal welfare in labs of pharmaceutical, chemical, and medical device companies when they're doing testing for regulatory requirements. Dr. Shalcraft, thank you so much for being here. Tell us about yourself.
Thank you so much. Yeah, I'm kind of all over the place. I have an interest in animal welfare and animal behavior. Animal welfare is basically the applied knowledge of animal behavior to animals, usually in confined settings. I also consult in people's homes on behavior problems of cats and dogs. And I also consult with local shelters to try to help cats and dogs in the shelters become more adoptable as well too. My background actually is chimpanzees who use sign language. In graduate school, I studied with the pioneers in the field, Alan and Trixie Gardner, and they meticulously documented the acquisition and use of signs of American Sign Language by 5 chimpanzees. And I continue as a hobby to study similar types of interests in chimpanzees who do not use sign language. I'm particularly interested in gestures and the way chimpanzees emphasize their gestures and emphasize the signs they use. In my work with the general public, my goal is really to teach people how to look for patterns in each case, as well as across cases. Looking for patterns in nature, it comes from the school of Charles Darwin, who thought that differences between species are of degree and not kind. In other words, we have similar behaviors and capacities across species, but the amounts and the extent may differ. My background, I got into the interest of animal behavior probably in college. I thought I was just going to go into human-oriented psychology, but I started learning about people working on animal welfare and animal rights, and I just wanted to know more about really just natural behavior and how natural behavior would lead to the need for animal welfare and would lead people to work on animal rights.
Wow, that's fascinating. I can't wait till we get some of the questions in the next hour. And we have Dr. Leslie Curran. Leslie is a senior faculty member of the Biological Science Department at the University of New Hampshire. She has her BA in Interdisciplinary Studies from Amherst College, Massachusetts. She has her PhD in Biological and Behavioral Studies disciplines from Michigan State. And she studies social interaction and behaviors in the animal world. So, Dr. Curran, tell us a little bit more about yourself.
Sure. Thank you. And thank you for having me. So yeah, I was thinking about when I first got interested in animals, and I guess it was probably watching Wild America with Marty Stouffer with my mom on Sunday mornings, 35 years ago. And I've been interested in them ever since. And I've both had pets growing up and have watched them, but then also been pretty keen on studying wild populations. And that's my research has been on primarily wild animals. And so I kind of think about animal behavior from through a more evolutionary lens and kind of through a bigger picture, I guess. I consider myself a behavioral ecologist, I think, first and foremost, which is behavioral ecology is animal behavior through the lens of evolution and ecology. So yeah, excited to be here. Thanks.
Hey, yeah, that's fascinating. I think this is going to be a great hour. So the first question I think you have all already answered. How did you get involved with this? And let us see if we have some questions from the audience here. Oh, all right. Let's go with what types of training does an animal behaviorist undergo, either academic or business purposes? Dr. Haupt?
Well, there are two ways you can go. The hard way, which is to go to veterinary school, maybe get a PhD, and then become board certified by the American Veterinary Medical Association. So that means that you need to see 400 cases, write a paper, do case reports, take a 2-day exam, and then you can put an extra 4 letters after your name. It's a little easier to go the route where you go to college, you get a PhD in a relevant field, and then you can be certified by the Animal Behavior Society as a behaviorist, an applied behaviorist. So either type of training means that you can, put up a sign and see cases get bitten by dogs all day long.
Okay, yeah, Dr. Sheldrath.
Oh, I just wanted to point out an interesting thing. There's debate about the word behaviorist because usually, behaviorist is usually somebody who studies in psychology and they go on for an advanced degree in psychology and they focus on the field of behaviorism. That's traditionally where it came from. And now it's also applied to a field of study in veterinary medicine. But I think the word behaviorist has become quite popular amongst the general public. And so there are a lot of people who want to become a behaviorist, but they don't necessarily want to go through the traditional schooling that the rest of us have gone through. So the school that I teach at is a program that gives certificates. It's not an academic program that gives either undergraduate or graduate degrees. But I do get a lot of students coming in saying they want to be a behaviorist. And what I do is I tell them that just don't call yourself that. You're not going to be a behaviorist when you come out of this program. You're learning about behavior. You might be able to work in a shelter environment, for example. A lot of the students do, but just give yourself a name like a behavior specialist or something like that. And keep the word behaviorist for the rest of us who did the grunt work, went through the advanced training for it.
Great, thank you. Okay, sorry, do we have another comment? Nope. Okay, next question. In studies, how does one determine a specific behavior, stimulus followed by a response, versus a random act?
Probably a matter of repetition. If an animal does something randomly, it's not something it's likely to repeat on a regular basis. If it's something that is purposive, then you will see that it's doing it again and again in a certain set of situations. Probably you will be able to discern what the goal is of that behavior.
Okay, that makes sense. Anybody else? Go ahead, Dr. Schaubert.
I had mentioned in my intro that one thing I teach is looking for patterns, and I think what Linda mentioned fits into that. Where we're looking for patterns, we're looking for antecedents. That would be the stimulus. We're looking for the behavior, which is the response, and we're also looking at consequences too. And sometimes we refer to that as the ABCs: antecedent, behavior, consequence. What happens before, during, and after? And if we can collect enough information about each incident, we'll see patterns that form across these A, Bs, and Cs.
Okay, well, that's very helpful. When we were discussing how to put this together and what we hope to get out of it, one of the things was just that. How do you know what you know and how do you interpret that? So that was very helpful. Thank you. The next question is from Sandy. The mention of sign language with chimpanzees made me think of dog training with hand gestures like sit and down. Are the similarities between dogs and chimps and other animals when using signs?
Dogs don't use their hands. They will use their paws though, but not in the same way. You won't ever be able to teach a dog to use ASL. But yes, they can interpret hand signals, and they're actually very well attuned to us, more so than chimpanzees, insofar that if you point at something, a dog is much more likely to follow where you pointed and go look there than a chimpanzee would. I think Val would agree on that.
And pointing and the understanding of a point is a whole big field in psychology. So
right,
it's fascinating.
I'm simplifying things.
I know. Yeah, right.
Okay, Dr. Karen.
I was just going to add that what that kind of made me think of is how a lot of animals, but mammals specifically, rely really heavily on gestures of their own, right, to each other. And so us using our hand gestures to train dogs, or co-opting their existing brain mechanisms that are capable of and have evolved to cue into really subtle motions. I mean, you can see that with dogs, when dogs are interacting with each other, or chimps for that, right, of course. And so I think when we introduce hand gestures, we're like piggybacking on the brain structure and they're basically the equipment that they already have to pay attention to that kind of thing.
Wow, very
In
interesting.
fact, I think dogs, the same as chimps, with a lot of the chimpanzee studies, the chimps that have learned ASL teach other chimps in the colony ASL that have not been specifically taught by humans. And in the same way, I have seen dogs, especially service dogs, that have been learned to alert to particular patterns, and they will actually train other dogs to respond to the same stimulus. I had one dog that I'd bred that was trained to respond to the owner's migraines. And he did this by waking her up by lying on her chest, because it was normally first thing in the morning that she had the migraines. And he got kind of arthritic in his old age. And she woke up one morning, cracked an eye, and saw him pushing his grandson onto the bed, telling him, she needs to be woken up and I can't do it, so get up there. And the grandson's looking rather puzzled, but he does what his grandfather tells him to do. So, animals can learn and then they can teach other animals. It's fascinating.
Okay, Dr. Haupt.
And the other use of sign language is many dogs become deaf. And so you may need to use signing to tell them to sit and down and come and so on. Unfortunately, then they have to be facing you. So
that's when you use the vibrating collar to get their attention. But
stamp on the floor. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so Dr. Aronson, following up, do these animals, do they teach each other like automatically, or do you have to encourage them to say, okay, you're the professor today, teach everybody else?
I think, most of my experience has been that they take it upon themselves. Service dogs, in my experience, are all pretty dedicated workers. And as such, they know there's a job to be done. And if they can't do it, they're going to push somebody else into taking over the job. One dog can follow. You can make them the teacher, by showing that this is the scent you alert to. But I think, or this is how you open the door, or this is how you pick up the phone. But I think that a lot of it is they take it upon themselves to be teachers in the same way that humans do.
Interesting. And Dr. Curran, you had mentioned that the animals have their own sort of sign languages to themselves. What would be an example of that?
Well, I think ones that we can all recognize are signs of maybe aggression or submission in a lot of animals, like dogs, but not just dogs, right? Lots of mammals have similar signs of submission, like putting their ears back or putting their bums on the ground or rolling over. I mean, I think one of the really interesting ones is when, sometimes I think people find it curious that dogs sometimes greet each other by smelling each other's genitals. And it's actually a really interesting thing and they're not the only ones that do it. So I did my graduate work on spotted hyenas, and they do the same thing. They greet each other by standing parallel and opposite and lifting their legs and smelling each other's crotches. But it's a powerful gesture because they're exposing the most vulnerable part of themselves to this really dangerous weapon, right? A mouthful of sharp canines that could do real damage if it wants to. And so by saying, like, I trust you enough to put my stuff right near your mouth, I mean, that's a really powerful way of saying I'm here in peace, right? It's like a handshake. And so I think in addition to there being all kinds of communication through smells, by doing that kind of thing. But so, that's I think an example of like a gesture that they use with each other.
Oh, excellent. Thank you. Yes, Dr. Chalcraft.
I just wanted to mention that I think also the more social the species, the more elaborate their communicative responses and repertoire is. And often when I'm working with cat clients, I explain to my clients that cats evolved as a solitary species, whereas dogs are pack animals and humans are pack animals and primates are pack animals. We give them all different names, the packs different names. But with cats, they have a limited repertoire. And I usually tell clients that it's all about mating, hunting, or defending territory. And of course, we have to we spay and neuter to reduce the population. So there goes the mating. The hunting, the more and more people are keeping cats inside now. So we have to take advantage of toys and other things to fulfill that natural behavior. And by realizing that cats have a limited repertoire, it might be also why we see cats without what I want to say, limited facial expressions, for example. We know that dogs have smiles and can cock their heads a little bit more. Cats are more limited, and they have more of a limited communication via their ears and their eyes as well. But in the end, a lot of behavior problems in the home end up being territorially related. So we take away their mating, we have to try to give them the hunting opportunities, but a lot of our problems end up being territorial in the house.
Wow. Okay, that was excellent. Very educational. Thank you. The next question comes from Meredith Sabo-Jones of Bristol, New Hampshire. So dogs sense a migraine coming on.
Yep. Yes. We don't know how, but dogs are very good at observers. They're incredible observers. They really watch us more closely than we watch each other. And somehow or other, they can sense a migraine coming on. They can pick up the scent of cancer in the body. They can, this same dog that responded to the migraines, he also responded to asthma attacks by alerting his owner before she had an asthma attack so she could get her inhaler. I don't know that we'll ever explain how they do it because They can't talk and tell us, but they clearly do know when these things are going to happen, and they're very good at predicting them. The same way that I guess we've observed that animals can tell when there's going to be a bad earthquake. Obviously, they don't have all the wonderful seismographs and equipment that, people who look at these, geologists look at these, but they know, and they get out of Dodge in time to avoid getting hit by lava. So there's a lot in the animal world that we don't understand. I don't know that we'll ever will understand, but yes, dogs can sense migraines.
Wow. Okay, excellent.
Oh,
Next
and
question.
I'm sure people have seen the recent press about a few studies coming out recently about dogs being trained to smell COVID.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Really? Okay. Our next question comes from the Sea Science Center. I have heard a lot of people did citizen science research using their own pets during the pandemic. Is this type of research valuable, and do you consider citizen scientists in your work?
I think most animal behavior comes from observation, and some citizens are better at observing than others. We've all gone through quite a lot of training to get where we are, but I also see no reason. When I talk to a client, they live with the animal. I'm just seeing the animal on a short-term basis. So I always want to hear what their observations are about their animal. Maybe I will agree with them. Maybe I'll find them very anthropomorphic and not terribly credible, but I always want to hear what they have to say.
Okay, Dr. Hope?
There's been a lot of surveying of dog and cat and horse owners, and that's a good way to do citizen science. You can tell which breed of dog is going to bite. Even the owner admits the dog is going to bite. And what kind of salt horses like, which is my study at the moment. So it's fun and it's inexpensive.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Dr. Curran.
You can, Dr. Shawcraft can go first.
Sure, Dr. Shawcraft.
Thank you. I just was going to say there's some studies on pheromones. Everybody's interested in pheromones and whether these products that you can buy are any use. And a lot of the studies involve researchers who train clients with their own cats or dogs at home to make these observations and then report back. But they usually go through a period of training. And so the people, the citizens at home know what to look for. They get a little bit of a crash course in behavior. And so when they report their results, it's more easy to generalize across the clients, across the citizens, the subjects.
Wow. Okay, Dr. Curran.
I was just going to say that I have used some citizen science. So I do pretty small scale research projects with undergraduates pretty frequently, and I try to keep them pretty cheap. Someone already mentioned, right, the citizen science can be really inexpensive, and so students really like to do stuff with pets, and it lends itself really well to citizen science because we know a lot of people with pets, right? So it's easy to get a lot of access. And this was true even before the pandemic, but in the pandemic, sometimes I would say we've kind of gone about it in two different ways. One is the researcher kind of does all the observations, but maybe does them over Zoom, or maybe the owner takes a video recording under whatever circumstances are making sense, for the experiment or the study, and then the experimenter kind of extracts the data from that. That's one way of doing it. Another way of doing it is to have people collect their own data of their own dogs or their own pets. And I think the key there, I teach a lab where I do that with my students. And the key there is to just create really simple, straightforward instructions that everyone can follow. You don't need a lot of special equipment, and that are hard to screw up, right? that there aren't like lots of different interpretations of the instructions and stuff like that. So I think it's a really valuable research tool, because not just because it's a way to collect data that you can scale up, but also because it helps connect everyone with the scientific process, right? And bring science into the home and engage people with their own like intellectual curiosity.
Wow, great. Thank you. Our next question comes from Stacy Samoji, a very close friend of Science Cafe. My dogs are dog friendly when they are alone or walk. When together, they lose their minds when they see another dog barking, pulling, snapping at each other. What makes this otherwise dog behave this way?
I think we might all answer that.
Go ahead, Dr. Hope.
Well, dogs, as was mentioned, are pack animals, and they tend to be braver when they're with another dog, and they're braver when you're attached to the leash than when they're loose. So that's the explanation for that, I think.
Wow. Fascinating. Yes, Dr. Chalcraft.
And the attacking they do to each other would probably be considered redirected aggression. So that tension is directed towards that other dog on the sidewalk coming towards them. They can't get to that other dog because of the leash, so they get to who's most convenient, and that's the dog next to them.
Okay, very interesting. Our next question.
She just described pandemic interactions of every family. Redirected aggression because we can't get it to anyone else.
Right. And also, I guess I was, okay, here's an example. The listener asked about dogs going crazy. And I, in my mind, interpreted that as aggression towards each other. And what I should have said, can you please describe what you mean by going crazy? Describe the behavior rather than give an interpretation of it. And then I would be probably better to then discuss the behavior described rather than the interpretation. The interpretation screwed me up. So if the dogs are aggressive to each other, then that would be redirected.
No, she said that. She said barking, pulling, and snapping. Yeah.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Thank you.
You're good.
Okay, thank you. Next question. We have seen that certain animals have been domesticated. Can this be done over time with members of the current wild population?
I can answer that one a little bit. Maybe not. So not every species is really capable of domestication to the same degree. That's one part of it. And then over time, that can mean a few generations with modest gains, but in some species, it could mean thousands of generations, right? And for some species, it might mean never at all. So I think that, I don't know. And I would be interested to hear what some of the other panelists say, but I think the answer varies really widely for different species.
Okay, Dr. Hope?
So there is an example where the Russians domesticated foxes, and it took them 55 generations to get fairly tame foxes, and they're really cute, and you can buy one for about $5,000, and they like to play and they like to cuddle and so on, but they can't be housebroken.
Really?
Yeah.
Was that 55 generations of foxes or people?
Foxes. No, a little faster than that. Foxes.
I think wild animals are probably always wild. We can take them into our homes, but we're not going to be able to say that they're ever tame. On one level, we can't ever say that there is no dog that would never bite, because there's probably some stimulus that would make any dog bite. But I think that, we have a parrot here. You may hear him occasionally in the background, but he's being quite good at the moment. But he's not tame. He's lived with us for 22 years. Yes, he'll climb on your finger. Will he bite you? Oh, yeah. He'll do that too. He has a much lower threshold for biting than the dogs and cats and horses that we live with too. So yeah, wild animals are wild animals, and that's by definition they're not tame. And it doesn't matter how cute and cuddly they are, housebreaking them is the problem. Other social behaviors that we expect of our tame animals are not things that they're going to learn. So
Okay, Dr. Childcraft.
This is an interesting question because it comes up with my students in one particular module. But we talk about how going back to the idea of pack animals being easier to domesticate because we humans step into their world and start manipulating. They're open to others. It's thought that perhaps cats, they may not even be domestic. There's a debate as to whether they're domestic right now or not. They came from a species of cat which is considered the most tameable of the wild cats. It's the African wild cat. So somebody went around testing all the cats to see how tameable they were. And it also leads to questions about some of the hybrids when we're bringing in species that are considered less tameable, like the Asian leopard cat, to become Bengals and things like that. But also, I think it also depends on an individual level too. There's something called the critical period of socialization in cats and dogs, and I think with humans too, especially with language. If they don't get the right input or exposure, for example, to a variety of humans in the first 3 months of life, dogs and cats, then after 3 months, they're going to start being afraid, and it's going to be harder and harder to teach them that humans are okay. So the cats that we see on the street that run from you, we call those feral cats. They've not had socialization or very little socialization. And so it's feral to me basically means wild. And so cats basically are born wild. And if we give them the right input, then each cat will tame up.
Okay. All right, the next question. It appears to be obvious that animals can feel fear and anger, but what other emotions are animals across the range of species capable of? And how do we determine what those emotions are? I.e., how do we know a behavior corresponds to, for example, happiness? Any takers?
Well, there we're going back to Descartes. How do we know an animal is happy? Because they repeat the behavior, because it seems to bring them joy. To me, it's kind of a semantic difference. I think that, if an animal seems happy, I'm probably going to believe he's happy or she's happy. They get pleasure, it seems, out of certain things. Those are the things that they repeat. They will avoid other things which don't give them pleasure or make them happy. And that's probably, how can we tell a person is happy? How do we know that what I describe as happy is the same as what Dr. Haupt describes as being happy?
Okay, Dr. Curran.
I was going to say something similar about, what is happiness, right? How do we define happiness? I guess my reaction to that question is kind of bifurcated. Part of me would say, well, one way of thinking about it is we can never know, right? Because you can't ever tell for sure if an animal's repeating an action because it's deriving some kind of pleasure, right? That, like, the way we would define pleasure, or if it's doing it because it's been selected, because there's been natural selection for it to do that because it has fitness benefits. But another way of thinking about it is there are actually ways that we can test where we could say, well, what is pleasure or what is happiness in humans? Well, maybe it's when you have a release of dopamine, or maybe it's when certain regions in your brain light up, right? And there are actually very cool studies that look at, like, do fMRI in certain animals and show that, well, they're, the regions of our brains that light up when we are happy, the way we define it ourselves, right? You could say these things make me happy. They can strap you to an fMRI and map where your brain lights up. And then we can see if those same regions are lighting up in a dog or in another animal when we are doing something that we might predict gives it pleasure. That might be a pretty close that's a pretty close proxy to saying it's a good guess that animal's feeling happy, right? It's showing the same physiological signs. and then so you could like be super technical about it in that way, or say, well, you don't know. But then the dog owner in me is like, any dog owner, you can just look at your dog and know when, right? Like you know when they're happy, you know it when you see it. And so although part of me wants to be like, well, we can never really know, no pet owner actually thinks that, right?
Nope.
Right, exactly. So there are some things where you can tell when an animal is happy. But the problem, and I think Dr. Aronson alluded to this earlier, or someone mentioned anthropomorphism, but it's a kind of a fine line, right? It's very, you can tell when your dog feels guilty or when your dog feels happy, but there's kind of a sliding scale where, well, I think my dog has a lot of shame for this thing that happened a year. Like it's a slippery slope to all of a sudden we're ascribing all these human emotions.
Hey,
There's a cute story about one of our patients years ago who this dog was a West Highland White Terrier who the owner refused to use a crate when he was house training, and the dog was never really house trained. And he said, the dog knows he's doing wrong because he always slinks away and looks guilty when I come home. And it took some convincing, but we eventually got the dog housebroken, and he was very reliably house trained. And then the owner got a new puppy. And he knew by this stage that, he was at fault if the dog had an accident in the house, or a deliberate in the house. And he didn't yell at the dog or slap it with a newspaper or whatever he was doing with the first one. And he would come home and find urine or feces on the ground, and the puppy would be happy and greeting him and bouncing up and down, or looked happy. And the older dog, meanwhile, have slinked off because he associated the urine or feces with being yelled at, even though he had gone through a period of retraining. When he hadn't been yelled at, he still associated this with punishment. So what is happiness?
Dr. Shellcraft, did you want to mention something?
Oh, just two quick things. So in the field of behavior, often what we do is we study the behavior, we report on the behavior, we point out patterns, and then we let the reader decide on the implications and what that might mean about emotions. But the reptilian brain, which is a part of the brain right in the center, in the inside, the absolute center. I don't want to say cortex because the cortex is actually the outer, but the reptilian brain is thought to be the site of emotions. And so not only mammals have the reptilian brain, but reptiles have the reptilian brain. So for that reason, I think it could be that that emotions are more universal than some might think.
Okay. Well, the next question. How real are shows like My Cat from Hell with Jackson Galaxy or The Dog Whisperer with Cesar Millan? How much is behavior therapy and how much is Hollywood?
100% Hollywood.
100% Hollywood. Really?
Yeah.
And 20% cruelty in the case of Cesar Millan.
Yeah. Well, Hollywood's pretty cruel, I gather.
Yeah.
Okay. And why do you think that? Oh, Dr. Shellcraft, did you want to mention something?
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
Because there's no follow-up. I mean, as Dr. Haupt says, yes, there's a lot of cruelty. There have been instances in which Cesar Millan has hung dogs from their collars until they turn blue and stop breathing. That's cruelty. That's not how animals learn. Animals do not learn through punishment, and we have study after study to show that. This is why training with shock collars does not work. You don't learn through fear, and hopefully we've learned that in humans. We don't teach our children now by beating them into submission. And similarly, we don't get nearly as far beating an animal into submission or hanging it by the neck until it stops breathing. And follow-up studies of animals that have been on shows like The Dog Whisperer, which actually wasn't originally a title that belonged to Cesar Millan. It was somebody else's title that was usurped. Have shown that those dogs become more fearful and regress and are actually harder to train after he leaves them. I would say 100% Hollywood and 20% cruelty.
Yes, Dr. Haupt.
Galaxy, on the other hand, seems to be pretty good. I've watched a few of his shows, and he's big into feline enrichment. So what could be wrong with that?
I haven't watched his shows, so I wouldn't know about that. I'm sorry.
Dr. Shalcraft.
I watch Galaxy too. And the only way I differ from him, other than, well, there's a lot of ways that I differ from him, but the main way is that when he goes into a case, he wants to recreate the problem for the camera. I don't want to recreate the problem right then and there. My goal really is to walk into the door and start preventing that problem and seeing how we can start practicing new behavior, because each time that behavior is practiced, it's just one more notch on their belt. They get that much better at it.
Okay, well, that was a great explanation. Next question. Which animals would you consider to have great or significant intelligence, and why? Anybody have a favorite? Dr. Haupt?
Well, all of our domestic animals are obviously intelligent enough to get us to take care of them.
I was actually going to say that they have different forms of intelligence, which probably benefit their species, so that each animal has the right intelligence for how it lives.
Yes, Dr. Curran.
Yeah, there's a lot of disagreement in the cognition community, the animal cognition community, about the best way to define intelligence about that, right? Because there are a million different ways. And one of the most common ways is relative brain size, right? So how big is your brain relative to your body? And humans have the largest relative brain size, but other really big ones are not going to be surprising to anyone who's watched, a little bit of Animal Planet. Bottlenose dolphins, elephants, these are a lot of the usual, I will say hyenas are up there. These are the usual suspects. And one thing that a lot of them have in common, but not all, that's an important caveat, is what someone mentioned before, is the sociality. So there's a lot of evidence that being in a complex social system is a strong selective force for social intelligence, because you have to keep track of a lot more information, right? It's not just where do I live and where's the food and the water, but also who's that? And how are they related to me? And how are they related to each other? And who shared with me recently? And who wronged me recently, right? And all these complex social problems to navigate, and a complex social landscape. And that is a really strong selective force for a big brain, right? And so there's a lot of people who think that that's a big component of intelligence, but I think other things, or this is what I talk about with my students, the reason it's hard to define what is intelligence, right? What makes an animal smart is there are so many different ways to test it, but no one test is really great for lots of different species, right? So let's take something like a puzzle, right? That's something that's been used classically in animal behavior research as a puzzle box. Try to open this puzzle. And that's a great tool. I love a good puzzle box. But it's hard because you can't give a bird the same kind of puzzle box that you can give a cat, which is not the same that you can give a monkey, right? And so because their anatomy is going to already limit what they can do, both their size, their strength, whether they have opposable thumbs, right? Like what can, just because they might not be physically able to open something doesn't necessarily mean that they don't know how or couldn't figure it out, right? So that's one limiting factor. Another thing to consider is the relationship between something like memory and intelligence. Well, is something that can remember something, does that make somebody smart, right? So I'm thinking of species of bird where they can remember the location of 10,000 individual acorn locations. 10,000, right? That boggles the mind. But is that intelligent? I mean, I think by some measures it definitely is, but it's also not necessarily solving a novel problem. It's just having a really amazing memory, as opposed to maybe another measure of intelligence might be something like the tests they've given crows, where they give them a bunch of tools but don't teach them how to put them together. Are they then able to like figure out how to put these tools together in a very particular configuration to solve a problem they've never seen before, that they've never been trained before? Of course, the answer is usually yes, they can. But anyway, so there's all like, I think that's a big part of that question is there's not one great way to measure it, and everybody's biased towards like their own species. And yeah.
There was, when they were testing the intelligence of Coco the gorilla, they were giving her intelligence tests that were designed for human children. And one of these was, which one of these doesn't belong in a group? And they were things you eat. And she picked the ice cream cone, whereas the answer was supposed to be the tree, which clearly is an example of speciesism, because, you know, she ate leaves. But she hadn't been exposed to ice cream because it's not very healthy food to feed a gorilla.
Right.
And you know, the same with dogs. You know, when we talk about the most intelligent breed of dogs, we usually go for the one that's the most obedient. Maybe the dog that doesn't do what we want them to do, but does what they know they should do instinctively, is smarter. I've done a lot of herding with my dogs. And I will admit that they know a heck of a lot more about how the sheep or the cattle or the ducks are going to behave than I do. And, you know, so there comes a time in certain things we do with our animals where we're training them, where we have to let them use their natural intelligence over, you know, their obedience. And so I've never really sort of bought into these breeds are more intelligent than others. I think the ones that can think for themselves are probably the most intelligent.
Okay, thank you. Next question, interesting. Do animals play, or more specifically, how widespread is play throughout the animal kingdom?
Yes.
Yes, they do.
They all play. Most of them play. You know, they play more when they're younger, and it's how they learn, you know, behaviors for when they get older. They play hunting because later on they're going to have to learn to hunt. They play running away because that's how they get away from predators. And they play because it's fun. At least we assume it is, because we have fun watching them play.
Interesting.
They also play fights in order to prepare them for battle.
Yeah, well.
And play safe.
Okay. So this is going to be our last audience question, and I have one more question for all of you. So the last audience question is, what would you call the most interesting learned behavior you have seen in an animal? Any ideas? Sure.
For me, in my practice, it's attention-seeking behavior. So I define learned behavior as a behavior that's happened for some other reason, for whatever reason, but it may have gotten the attention of a guardian in the home, and it takes on a new meaning. Now the behavior might increase in frequency in order to get the attention from the human. I'll often see it in cases where a person's on the telephone and the cat or the dog is all of a sudden scratching at them, either scratching the couch or pawing at them or even attacking them. It only happens when the person's on the telephone in some cases, which to me means it's an attention-seeking behavior. So there's all sorts of kind of nuisance behaviors that get people's attention, and then it seems that cats and dogs learn to use those behaviors for the sake of getting attention in the future.
And toddlers.
Yeah. And animals train us, which is, probably a sign of intelligence.
Outsmarting us.
My husband is very well trained by the dogs. He says, "Why don't they do that for you?" I said, "Because I don't let them."
Okay, so we'll have one more question, and it's for all of you. And we will start with Dr. Haupt. The question is, if there was one thing from this session that you want the audience to remember, it would be what?
That your dog or cat or horse is probably not acting guilty. The story, as a proud owner of a Westie, I was very impressed with the poor Westie who acted, quote, guilty when he was really acting fearful. So.
Okay, Dr. Aronson, one thing.
Socialization is the reason, or lack thereof, lack of socialization is the root of most of the problems we see in our domestic animals. And as Dr. Haupt pointed out, the first 12 weeks or maybe it was one of the others, I forget. But the first 12 to 16 weeks of a dog or cat's life are the most important weeks, and this is where they learn the most. And if they miss out on those weeks, it can lead to serious behavioral problems. And this is what we see in practice all the time as really being the root cause of a lot of the behavior problems we see.
So are there basic things that the owner should do, or take it to a professional, or just learn how to act and interact with the animal?
In terms of proper socialization, start early, start often. The breeder should be enriching the environment of an animal from the get-go. Long before their eyes and ears open with dogs and cats, we start introducing them to new situations. We start introducing them to new temperatures, hot and cold, texture, touch, and we build on that, and then they go to their new homes. Before the pandemic, when I was raising a litter of puppies, I'd start taking them different places by the time they were 5 and 6 weeks old, introducing them to different people, children, adults, men with beards, people in funny hats, people who do silly things and make funny noises. The more new things you can introduce during that period, the less fearful, the less aggressive, the less unable to cope with their world an animal will be. I know people who hide their animals away if there's a loud noise. I did evaluation of a litter of puppies that every time someone put a lawnmower out, even half a mile away, the owner would rush the animals in and put them in their kennel in a completely deprived area. There were no toys, there was no noise, there were no visual stimuli. And these puppies at 8 weeks were almost like feral animals. They were terrified of everything. And so the more, good exposure. You don't want to expose them to scary things that are going to terrify them. You don't want to beat them. You don't want to do anything bad, but you want to make them, introduce them to a world which is good and forgiving and where they can learn. And giving them the best start in life is the best thing we can do for our animals.
Great, thank you. Dr. Chalcraft, one thing that you want people to take away from here.
Well, it builds a little bit on what Dr. Aronson was saying, and it's really a preventative approach. So my advice would be proactive rather than reactive. Do your citizen research, figure out what the ABCs are, antecedent behavior, consequence, look for those patterns. And when you can predict something's going to happen, step in and set the cat or dog up for success by offering an alternative behavior. you might practice that alternative behavior in a calm environment first. So when things are stressful, they're more likely to be able to follow through and comply and take part in that behavior. But like I said, each time they practice it, they're that much better at it. So if you're waiting for them to do the bad behavior, then saying no to them, no doesn't teach them what to do instead. Plus, they've practiced it. So try to be proactive, predict, set them up for success, get them on a new behavior pattern track, and soon the old behavior will be dropping out.
Great, thank you. Dr. Curran, what would you like people to remember from this session?
Sure, I'll try to keep it short and sweet. We didn't explicitly talk about this, but one thing that you hear a lot in discourse about animal behavior and human behavior is nature versus nurture. And I guess I'd like the audience to leave with the understanding that very few, arguably no behaviors are nature or nurture, right? Meaning nature meaning controlled by your genes or the animal's genes, and nurture meaning completely driven by their environment. Almost everything is a combination of both to some degree. And sure, some things are more one or more the other, but almost everything has the influence of both. So it's not nature versus nurture, it's nature and nurture.
Oh, okay. Well, thank you. Thank you for joining us. Would the panel please stick around for just a couple more minutes? Now I'm going to invite Adele to say a few words and as we start our closing. So Adele, you're on.
Thank you. And thank you to the panelists. This has been an excellent discussion. And on behalf of everyone at the Sea Science Center, we want to thank everyone who participated and watched, and especially to the panelists for sharing their expertise with us. It has been a pleasure partnering with Science Café New Hampshire for this event, and we hope to keep the discussions going here in New Hampshire because it's always more to learn. As far as our program, Science on Tap is going on summer break now, and we hope to resume in person in the fall. So keep an eye out on Eventbrite and the Sea Science Center's webpage for this fall when we get back to our new season. In the meantime, I would like to take you a moment to tell you about a new initiative the Sea Science Center is participating in. It's called Seeing Strong Storms. We're joining science centers across the country to take a closer look at the impacts of climate change, and in our case, it's extreme precipitation. And we're inviting members of our community to participate in citizen science projects and to join us for a national forum on extreme precipitation, which will occur on July 14th. The signups for that forum will be opening on June 30th. So we'll send an email out to our audience and post it on our social media if anyone's interested in joining us for that. It's kind of like a science discussion, but you get to participate and think about a little bit more of a round table with smaller groups as well. So we encourage everyone to enjoy that. And while Science on Tap is going on summer break, the Sea Science Center is just about to open 7 days a week for the first time in quite a long time. So if you have some young ones visiting this summer, please check us out as well. Back to you, Rick.
Glad you mentioned that because I was going to ask you if the Science Center was open again. So that's great news. And thank you, Adele, and your team. It's been a pleasure partnering with you on the session. Now, as we get to the closing remarks, a reminder that this episode is available for viewing or sharing online at our YouTube or Facebook channels shortly after we hang up tonight. And you can also take a look at a long things that are available in our library. And if you see something that piques your interest, just go ahead and look at it. So first, I want to thank the audience, both audience participating tonight. We hope you learned something and were entertained. I enjoyed myself immensely. So I want to thank the audience, but I really, really want to thank sincerely to our panel. You're always so generous with your time and your expertise, and it is greatly appreciated. So thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, and now next, the Science Cafe has its topic on July 21st of next month, and it's cyanobacteria in New Hampshire waterways. And with that, we want to tell you to enjoy the remainder of your evening. Hope you learned something and had a great time. And good night, everyone.
Good
Goodbye.
night.
Thank
Good
you
night.
all. Good night.
Bye-bye.
Bye.